This video was sponsored by Policy Genius.
Hey, welcome to another video. In this one, I'm going to do something a little different and something I've never done before, and I'm going to try and make a custom sign that looks like this. New logo. But I don't really know what I'm doing. I don't have a CNC machine, so we're just going to figure it out, and you guys are going to follow along and watch me do it. But for now, another thing you could do is check the link in the video description to our Patreon page. If you're not signed up over there, you're missing out. It's like a party every week. Every Monday morning, we do a weekly live question and answer. It's great, and you can watch that at any time. Doesn't have to be Monday. And there's a bunch of other perks, behind the scenes footage. You're gonna see a bunch of extra footage on this project that you're not gonna see just in the video. So if you're not signed up for Patreon, go do that. For now, I gotta figure out how the heck am I gonna make this sign with all those letters and everything. Let's get to work.
All right, let's make a sign. Not quite sure where to start. For me, I just started by obviously designing the logo that I wanted on the computer. Now I want the final thing to be colored like the one on the right, but I went ahead and made an all black version because I figured that would probably be easier to work from. I took this logo and I sent it off to a local print shop to have them print it full size on a piece of paper. But I'll talk more about why I did that a little later on. For now, I'm going to start gluing up the background of the sign. I decided to use this clear vertical grain cedar because eventually I'd like to put this sign outside, and I wanted a wood that would weather the weather. And cedar does great outdoors. I decided on a 36-inch circle for the size of my sign. So I took a bunch of these clear vertical grain cedar 2x4s and I started rough cutting them to the right length. And then I just stacked up enough until I knew I'd be able to cut a 36-inch circle. Then I stuck in my brand new ISO tunes. These things are sweet. Bluetooth, hearing protection. I dig it. And yes, there is a link in the video description. And while I danced my way over to get some wood, I grabbed it and started running it through the joiner. You see, these are traditional 2x4s, which means they're rounded on four sides, and I wanted to get rid of that rounded profile so that I could glue them all up in a perfect slab. Continuing on my endeavor to perfect flat lumber, I ran each piece through the planer to get it nice and smooth on both sides. Now, I was almost ready to glue them up at this point, but I still had one more side I had to lop off. So for that, I went over to the table saw and I trimmed them all down. This gave me a perfectly rectangular piece that I could glue together to make a perfectly square piece that I could then use to cut out a perfectly round piece. Wow, it's a lot of geometry. So with all my pieces rough cut and milled up, it was time to start gluing them together. So I brought them all over and I set them in some clamps. But you know how I mentioned that I eventually would like this sign to go outside? That got me thinking, I couldn't just glue these up the normal way with a little Titebond 2 because that glue's not really rated for the outdoors. So I mixed up some thickened epoxy. I figured if anything would do well outside, it would be epoxy. And just to brace you, there is going to be a lot of epoxy used on this project. No, I have not crossed over to the dark side. I just know when it is appropriate to use epoxy and when it is not. And gluing things up for outside is a great example of when it is appropriate to use epoxy. So I smeared a bunch of this thickened epoxy between each crack and I clamped them all together. Then because I didn't want to have to deal with all the squeeze out, I wiped the whole thing down with a little acetone to clean it up and make it look purty. While I waited for my cedar to dry, I headed into town to pick up my prints from the print shop, aka Staples. That's the closest thing to a print shop we have in my hometown. But they were able to print out a full-size version of my logo onto some just regular old paper. This will come in very handy when it comes time to cut out our letters and our moth. By the time I got back, my slab was all dry and ready to take out of clamps. and looking pretty darn straight, just the way we like it. Because I wasn't able to wipe down the bottom side because it was in clamps, I flipped it over and just used a putty knife to scrape off all the squeezed out thickened epoxy. Then I took it over to my work table and I did my most favorite thing in the entire world. And that was sand it all smooth so that I had a good surface to work off of. Ugh, sanding. Can't I ever do a project where I don't have to sand things? I guess I am a woodworker after all. Once it was all sanded down, I left it flipped over, so this is actually the bottom of my slab, and I marked the very center of my glued up square. Then I grabbed my Rockler circle cutting jig and I pounded it into that center point. This jig is going to allow us to cut out a perfect 36-inch circle. So I chalked up my router with a spiral upcut bit from Bits and Bits, and I started cutting. Now, you've probably seen this before, but whenever I use a router jig, I don't like to cut all the way through. I just don't trust the router jig to make multiple passes and stay perfect. So I usually cut down about a half an inch, and then I cut out the rest with the jigsaw. But rest assured, I'm not closely cutting with the jigsaw. I'm just rough cutting it. And then we can use our initial pass from the router jig as a template with a flush cut bit to cut out the rest of the circle and make it perfect, without having to worry about that router jig bouncing around on multiple passes. So after I had the entire thing cut up, I chalked up a 1/4 inch flush cut trim router bit thingy-magoo, and I trimmed off the excess left behind by the jigsaw. And in no time, we now had a perfectly cut 36-inch circle out of this beautiful, clear, vertical grain cedar. So I sanded it down until it was nice and smooth, and then I flipped it back over. Now, the other thing that got me thinking was if this is going to be outside, there's a good chance that this sign is going to want to warp over time and turn into a potato chip. And I didn't want that to happen. So I thought it might be a good idea to inlay some C-channel on the back of the sign and just help prevent any warping that might happen in the future. So I picked up a few pieces of C-channel at the local big box store and I cut them to length on my DeWalt metal choppy saw thing. I don't use this very often, but boy is it fun to make those sparks fly. Then I took the C-channel back over to my piece and I just traced out where each piece would need to land. Then using a track for my track saw and that same upcut bit in my trim router, I carved out 2 grooves to allow that C-channel to sit down into the back of my sign. But I didn't want it to sit proud of the surface, so after cutting my 2 grooves, I also trimmed a little bit out of the middle, just about 1/8 of an inch, so that the C-channel could sit down perfectly flush in the back and it could still hang flush against a wall or a building or wherever I might mount this sign in the future. Then last but not least, I took each piece of C-channel over to my drill press and I drilled a few holes so that I could screw it to the back of the sign. Now, I will note that I drilled these holes extra large so that the screws have a little wiggle room inside that hole to account for seasonal wood movement. You don't want the screw to be really tight in there because if the wood moves, well, it's going to just bend that screw and possibly break it. So you want it to be a little floppy. In no time, I had that C-channel installed on the back of the sign and I was ready to get on to the fun part. All the accoutrements that we're going to put on the front of the sign, like our circular border, our letters, and of course our moth. Now, I mentioned that I wanted to be able to put this sign outside, so you might be a little concerned seeing me and Craig haul in this giant piece of MDF, because as most people know, MDF is not a material that you want outdoors. In fact, you don't want it near water at all. So why did I pick MDF to make all of my letters and border and everything out of? Well, I have a plan. Is it going to work? I have absolutely no idea, but the important part is I have a plan, and I'll share that with you as we move forward here. For now, I took my same router jig and I cut out a nice ring that'll sit just inside the diameter of our cedar circle. Next, it was time to get to work on the moth and the letters. So I unrolled this giant print I got from the print shop and I cut out the moth and the word bourbon. Now, you could just find a friend with a CNC to cut all these pieces out for you, but what fun is that? And robots kind of scare me, so I steer clear whenever possible. So instead of using a CNC, we're going to do this the old-fashioned way. I took some spray adhesive and just using the scrap circle from inside of our ring, I adhered the moth to this piece of MDF with that spray adhesive. Just rubbing here, rubbing there, and then I did the exact same thing with the word bourbon. Notice I'm not taking any care to make sure these are lined up in any particular spot. The important part is that they're just stuck firmly to the MDF. And yes, I did get black stuff all over my hands. Then I took a jigsaw and I just roughly cut out each piece so that I had a smaller hunk to work with. That was graceful. Now, because we don't have a CNC, we're gonna have to do this the old-fashioned way, with our eyeballs. Is it gonna be perfect? Well, not exactly, but if you go slow, you're gonna be able to get these pretty darn close to perfect, and nobody's really gonna be able to tell. It just takes a little bit longer. So I chalked up an 1/8" blade into my bandsaw, and very carefully I started individually cutting out each and every letter, going slow and trying to stay right on the edge of that black line. You could also use a scroll saw for this, which I will be using later, but I think the bandsaw is a little bit easier, especially with an 1/8" blade in there. In no time I had all of my letters cut out, and they were looking pretty darn good. Next, I went over to the drill press and I drilled a hole right through the center of each letter that, well, had a center to drill a hole through, because we still have to cut that out, and obviously we can't do that on the bandsaw. This is where the scroll saw comes in. The scroll saw is perfect for this project because you can thread that blade right through the middle and cut out those hard to reach places. This is a really old scroll saw. I don't even know where I got it. It's just been sitting on my shelf for years. I think maybe my uncle gave it to me? I don't remember. But it was sure handy to have when I needed to cut out the inside of all these letters. So again, very carefully, just taking my time and going slow, I cut out the interior of each letter until pretty soon I had all of them cut out and I was ready to move on to phase 2. And by phase 2, I mean doing the exact same thing to that giant moth.
Oh, hey, this video is sponsored by, oh wait, it's down there. One of our all-time favorite sponsors, Policy Genius. Now, if you're getting to the point in life where you're starting to think about your future, and maybe worst case scenario, if something were to happen to you, life insurance is one of those things that you just gotta check off your list. If you got somebody that depends on you for income, whether it be a child, a spouse, a loved one, you wanna make sure that they're gonna be taken care of if the worst should happen. Now you're probably thinking, but life insurance, it's such this big thing, you gotta fill out all this paperwork, it's a pain. Well, it doesn't have to be, and that's where Policy Genius comes in. And it's pretty simple. Listen to this.
With Policy Genius, in minutes you can work out how much life insurance coverage you need and compare personalized quotes to find your best price. You could save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius. Their licensed experts will help you understand your options and ensure you apply for the right policy. Policy Genius works for you, not the insurance company, so you can trust them to offer unbiased advice and help you navigate every step of the shopping and buying process. When you're ready to apply, the Policy Genius team will handle the paperwork and scheduling for free.
That's all well and good, but you're probably still thinking, all right, but where do I go? How do I sign up? Well, that part is crazy easy. You just do this.
It's simple. To start comparing quotes and simplify insurance buying, just check out policygenius.com/bourbonmoth.
policy genius. When it comes to insurance, it's nice to get it right.
So I took the moth over, and luckily this has no interior parts, so I was able to cut out the entire thing on the bandsaw. One tip I'll give you about cutting things like this out on the bandsaw is that it's much more important to have nice, smooth cuts than it is to stay right on your line. I mean, at the end of the day, nobody's going to know where your line was or wasn't, but they are going to see all the chatter left behind by the bandsaw if you don't have smooth cuts. So try and stay close to the line, but focus on those smooth cuts. Next, I needed to get all that paper and spray adhesive off my pieces of wood. This was done very easily with the drum sander. Now, if you don't have a drum sander, you could just use a palm sander, but it would take longer. So I used the drum sander. Now remember how I said I had a plan on how to use this MDF outdoors, even though it's not supposed to be outdoors? Well, here's step one. First, take a bunch of epoxy, have your foreman help you, and coat each and every piece so that it's sealed or encased in a solid layer of completely waterproof epoxy. This should stave off any moisture that wants to get to these pieces and make them expand and fall apart over time. Once the epoxy was dry, I just roughed it up with a little sandpaper so that the next layer of epoxy would stick. Then I just double checked all my letters to make sure I still had them all and that they would still spell out what I wanted it to, like boob run. Boob run? That's not right. Something's wrong here. Just move that, fix that, move that around there, and okay. Whew. All right. That looks better. That was awkward. Now, my plan to color both the letters, the moth, and the ring are to do tinted epoxy, and I'm just gonna pour it over like a donut glaze and let it run off the edges. But that being said, I didn't want the pieces to stick to my table. I needed them elevated a little bit so the epoxy had a place to run. So I just took a bunch of thumbtacks and stuck them in the bottom of each piece. This raised them a good 1/4 of an inch off the workbench, and hopefully that's enough to allow that epoxy to have some place to run to. Next, I mixed up some Total Boat high performance epoxy, and to make it black, I went over to my wife's printing studio and I just got some screen printing ink. This probably isn't the right thing to do, but it sure made that epoxy really black. Then I just started pouring it all over the top, kind of like glazing a cookie, just letting it run every which way. Now yes, there's going to be a crazy amount of drips on the bottom of each one of these pieces, but don't worry, I have a plan for that too. In no time, I had my moth entirely coated, and it was time to do the exact same thing to my outer ring thingamabob. This was a little more tricky just because it was so skinny, but I used a plastic squeegee, and in no time I had the entire thing coated and, well, looking like a black ring. That sounds like a pirate movie. The Black Ring. Avast. Anyways, after I poured all the epoxy, I took out a torch and I got all the bubbles out. Next, it was time for these letters. Now, for the letters, I decided to do something a little different. Yes, I will be pouring epoxy, but I wanted them to kind of look like they were made out of brass. So how do you make epoxy look like brass? Well, I don't know the answer to that because I don't know what I'm doing. But the way I did it was I got on Amazon and I ordered a bunch of powdered brass. Yeah, that's a real thing. It's literally just powdered brass. And I mixed it in with the epoxy along with just a little bit of gold pigment so that it wasn't so brown. Then once again, harnessing my inner baker, I started pouring all that epoxy over each letter like frosting, making sure not to miss any spots. And when I did miss a spot, Craig was kind enough to point out my mistakes. He wasn't kind enough to actually help, but he was kind enough to sit there and point out my mistakes. And in no time, my letters were coated, and all I could do now was wait for them to dry. Well, actually, I waited for them to dry and then I did another coat. And that's when I realized this mistake. Apparently, your N can be upside down. And if you don't have it oriented the right way, like this, well, you end up pouring epoxy on the wrong side. And you gotta start all over again. You might be thinking, well, why don't you just make a new N or sand that down and just recoat that one letter? Well, I could do that, but I don't remember what ratio of brass powder and gold pigment I added to that epoxy the first time. So if I'm off just a little bit, my N's going to be a completely different color this go around. So the only thing to do was to sand every letter back down to bare wood and pour them again. But this time I'm going to make sure my N is the right side up. Wrong side, right side. All right, let's do this one more time. You know, it actually worked out pretty well because I thought the first pour was a little on the orangey side. So I added much more brass powder this go around, and I did the whole pouring process again. It is kind of fun to watch though, and for some reason makes me really, really want a sugar cookie. I'll be right back. While I waited for my letters to dry, my ring and moth were dry at this point, and ridiculously shiny. I don't like shiny. So I needed to tone that down a little bit. First, I flipped them upside down and ran them back through the drum sander to get rid of all those drips and make the backside perfectly smooth. I did this to the ring and the moth. Then I took them back over to the work table and set upon de-shining them. I didn't really know the best way to do this, but the way I decided to do it was just to take some 00 steel wool and, well, just scuff it up a little bit. This actually worked perfect to get rid of the sheen and give it a nice matte black look. You just go slow, making sure not to dig too deep into that epoxy and leave any big scarring behind. But in no time, I had a nice matte black look to the moth and the ring, and I was ready to get back to these letters, which I'm happy to say were oriented in the correct way now. Whew, that was a close one. Just like the moth and the ring, I thought the letters were a little too shiny as well, and I wanted them to look more like brushed or aged brass. So again, I took some steel wool and I just started sanding the crud out of them until they had a nice soft sheen that somewhat resembled brass. Actually, this video doesn't do it justice. In person, they look exactly like brass. The only way you can tell they're not is they're much, much lighter. And finally, it was time to start hooking all of my pieces to my clear vertical grain cedar and put the Dunzo stamp on this sign. So I started plopping all my pieces down, roughly where I thought they needed to go, every once in a while checking the computer and referencing my original design. And once I thought they were close, I grabbed a ruler and just made sure everything was spaced even from side to side. Once everything was spaced correctly, I took some green tape and I just put it, well, kind of all over the place so that I could use that as a reference to get everything back in position when I finally put glue on the back of all these pieces. I did that for my ring, for my moth, and then finally I did that for my letters as well. The letters were definitely the trickiest thing to get all lined up and straight so they didn't look all wonky. So I put a piece of tape on the bottom, I put a piece of tape on the top, and I put one piece of tape on the end. I figured I'd start at the end and then use a 5/8 inch spacer block and just work my way to the other side. Now I went back and forth on the best way to glue these things to the sign. I thought about using thickened epoxy and then I just settled on super glue. I figured worst case scenario, the super glue fails in a couple years and I'll just have to glue them back up there. But for now, this was by far the quickest and easiest way to get everything stuck down. And, at least for now, it worked great. Once I got the letters stuck down, I did the same thing to the moth, although I forgot to turn my camera on for that part, so here's me pretending to glue it down. And then I did the same thing on that outer ring, just using a nice thin layer of super glue. This ring's not very heavy, so it really doesn't need much. And then using that tape that I previously stuck down to get everything lined back up and looking good. I tried my best to keep squeeze out to a minimum, but let's be honest, there's always a little squeeze out. So I just used a 1/4-inch chisel, kind of like a card scraper, and scraped away any little pieces of squeeze out until it was back to the bare wood. I should also talk about the bare wood. I'm not going to put any finish on this cedar. Hopefully in time it'll just naturally gray and just add to the overall look and aesthetics of the sign. But for now, I did it. I used some cedar, some MDF, some epoxy, and my eyeball, and I made a nice custom sign.
Oh, hi. Hey, hope you enjoyed that video. Who knew you could use epoxy to do something cool and not just make a ugly river table? Wonder if Cam at Blacktail Studios knows that. Might have to call him. Anyways, hopefully you enjoyed that video. Check out the video description for links to all the products and stuff we used. If you haven't done so already, go over to Patreon, sign up over there. There's a ton of great perks you're missing out on. Ton of behind the scenes content, a weekly live question and answer, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So yeah, go sign up on Patreon. I'm also on Cameo now. I didn't even know what that was, but my shop assistant Craig signed me up. And basically you can go on there and I can send happy birthday wishes to people, or just nice messages, or you can make me say whatever you want. So check the link in the video description. And you'll find a place to hang this on the wall.